You're doing something wrong every single day, and you don't even realize it. And the price you're paying isn't small. It's your advantage, your control, and slowly, your position in every room you walk into. It doesn't look like a mistake. In fact, it feels right. It feels like honesty, openness, being real. You speak up quickly. You explain yourself clearly. You share what you're planning, what you're feeling, what you're thinking. And in that moment, it feels like connection. But what's actually happening is much more subtle and much more dangerous. Every time you reveal too much, you remove the need for others to figure you out. And when people don't have to figure you out, they start predicting you. And once someone can predict you, they don't need to compete with you anymore. They just adjust around you. That's where the shift happens, and most people completely miss it. You think you're building trust, but in reality, you're giving away leverage. You think you're being transparent, but what you're actually doing is making yourself easier to manage. And the most dangerous part? The people around you don't need to be malicious for this to happen. They don't need to use you intentionally. Human behavior naturally moves toward advantage. If someone knows your reactions, your limits, your patterns, they will, consciously or not, position themselves accordingly. That's how opportunities quietly pass you. That's how conversations start to tilt away from you. That's how someone else ends up one step ahead, even when you were just as capable. But here's the part most people misunderstand. The problem isn't that you're weak. It's that you're too readable. And being readable is far more costly than being unskilled. Because skills can grow in silence. But exposure? Exposure locks you into a pattern others can see, measure, and anticipate. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how the people who seem the most in control rarely explain themselves? They don't rush to respond. They don't fill silence just to feel comfortable. They let moments sit. They let people wonder. And in that space, something important happens. They keep their advantage. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because if you look closely, you'll start to notice how often you give things away without pressure. No one asked for the full explanation, but you gave it anyway. No one demanded your plan, but you shared it early. No one forced your reaction, but you showed it instantly. And each time, you think nothing of it. But each time, a small piece of your position disappears. This is where most people get stuck. They believe the solution is to become cold, distant, or silent all the time. But that's not the real answer. Because the truth isn't about saying less. It's about knowing what not to say and when. And that difference is where control begins. But almost no one is taught how to see that line. And until you do, you'll keep thinking you're being authentic, while slowly giving away the very thing that protects you. At first, Ethan didn't notice it. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. No one openly betrayed him. No one directly pushed him aside. But slowly, things started to shift in ways he couldn't explain. Conversations where he used to lead, he now followed. Opportunities he thought were his somehow slipped into someone else's hands. And the strangest part? The people around him still smiled, still nodded, still acted supportive. On the surface, nothing looked wrong. But underneath, everything had changed. See, Ethan had a habit he never questioned. Whenever he had an idea, he shared it immediately. Whenever he felt uncertain, he explained it out loud. Whenever something bothered him, he reacted in the moment. To him, it felt natural, like he was being honest, open, easy to work with. But what he didn't see was how predictable he had become. People didn't need to guess his next move, they already knew it. They didn't need to test his limits, he had already shown them. And over time, without saying a word, they adjusted. They spoke more carefully around him. They revealed less to him. They moved earlier than him. And Ethan couldn't understand why he always felt one step behind. Then one day, something small happened, but it changed everything. He mentioned a plan casually in a meeting. Nothing big, just an idea he was excited about. A few days later, someone else presented a refined version of that same idea and got the credit. No one accused anyone. No one argued. It just happened. And for the first time, Ethan paused. Not because of what they did, but because of what he had done. But here's the part most people get wrong. And this is where everything flips. Most people would say, you just need to trust less. Or, people are out to take advantage. But that's not the real issue. Because the truth is, people didn't change. Their behavior simply adapted to what was available. And Ethan had made too much available. He wasn't being targeted. He was being read. And once you understand that, something uncomfortable becomes clear. The problem isn't that people are always trying to use you. It's that you're making it easy for them to benefit from you without even trying. That's the real shift. Because now, the focus isn't on controlling others, it's on controlling what you reveal. And this is where Ethan started noticing someone else. Lucas. Same environment. Same meetings. Same level of skill. But completely different presence. Lucas rarely spoke first. When he did, it was measured. He never rushed to explain his thinking. He let silence sit longer than most people were comfortable with. At first, Ethan thought Lucas was just quiet, maybe even unsure. But the results told a different story. Lucas was always positioned well. His ideas landed stronger. His timing was sharper. And most importantly, no one ever seemed to get ahead of him. Not because he was faster, but because no one could anticipate him. And that's when it clicked for Ethan. The advantage was never about saying more. It was about revealing less at the right time. Because once people can't fully read you, they can't easily move around you. And when they can't move around you, you stop losing ground without even realizing it. But what Ethan still didn't fully understand was how much he was still giving away without noticing. What Ethan didn't realize yet was that this wasn't just about communication. It was about psychology. Because the moment you reveal something about yourself, your plans, your emotions, your limits, you're not just sharing information. You're shaping how people see you, and more importantly, how they decide to act around you. The human brain is wired to look for patterns. It constantly scans for predictability, for signals it can rely on. And once it finds a pattern, it locks onto it. That's why the first few times you explain yourself, people listen. But after a while, they stop listening and start anticipating. They no longer react to you in the moment. They react to the version of you they've already mapped out in their head. And that's where the real disadvantage begins. Because now you're not operating in real time anymore. You're operating inside someone else's expectations. And expectations are powerful. They simplify you. They reduce your complexity into something manageable, something controllable. For Ethan, this showed up in subtle ways. When he hesitated, people assumed he would hesitate again. When he agreed too quickly, people expected compliance. When he showed frustration, people knew exactly which buttons to press. None of this required bad intentions. It was simply efficient. People use what they know because it makes interactions easier for them. But here's the deeper layer most people never see. Once someone believes they understand you, they stop respecting your unpredictability. And unpredictability is where a lot of your real power comes from. Not chaos, not randomness, but the ability to not be fully mapped. Because when you're not fully mapped, people have to be more careful. They have to think twice. They have to observe instead of assume. And that alone shifts the dynamic in your favor. But when you expose everything, you remove that tension. You remove that uncertainty. And without uncertainty, there's no need for caution. That's why Ethan kept finding himself in the same position over and over again. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a lack of skill. It was a repeated pattern of overexposure. He was giving people the exact blueprint they needed to navigate around him. And once that blueprint exists, it doesn't disappear. It compounds. Every interaction adds another layer of predictability. Every reaction confirms what others already suspect about you. Until eventually, you're no longer surprising anyone. And when you stop surprising people, you stop influencing outcomes in a meaningful way. But here's where it gets even more subtle. Because this isn't just about what you say. It's about how quickly you say it, how easily you react, how consistently you respond the same way under pressure. Timing is part of exposure. Speed is part of exposure. The faster you reveal, the easier it is to read you. And the easier it is to read you, the easier it is to stay ahead of you. This is why people like Lucas seem different, even when they're not necessarily more skilled. They don't rush to close the gap. They let the gap exist. And in that gap, they observe. They decide. They choose what to reveal and what to keep. And that choice is where control lives. Because control doesn't come from forcing outcomes. It comes from managing information. And once Ethan started to see this, he realized something uncomfortable. He hadn't been losing because others were better. He had been losing because he made himself too easy to understand. And once someone fully understands you, they don't need to challenge you. They just need to move around you. It didn't take a big failure for Ethan to finally see it. It showed up in small, everyday moments, the kind most people ignore. Like a simple conversation at work. Someone asks, "What are you working on lately?" And without thinking, Ethan goes into full detail. The plan, the challenges, the timeline, even what he's unsure about. It feels harmless. It feels like connection. But a few days later, that same person brings up a similar idea, more polished, more confident, and suddenly, the room leans toward them. Ethan sits there, not understanding why his version feels weaker, even though it came first. Or think about this. You're in a group setting. Someone makes a subtle comment, slightly critical, and instantly, you respond. You explain yourself. You justify. You try to clear it up. In your mind, you're protecting your image. But what everyone else sees is something different. They see exactly where you feel insecure. They see how fast you react. They see how easy it is to trigger a response from you. And from that moment on, whether they realize it or not, they know where your edge is. Then there's the social side. You meet someone new, and within minutes, you start sharing personal stories. What you've been through, what you're trying to fix, what you're struggling with. It feels like you're building trust. But what you're really doing is fast-forwarding intimacy without knowing who you're giving access to. And once that information is out, you can't take it back. The other person now knows more about your emotional patterns than you know about theirs. And that imbalance? It doesn't disappear. It shapes every interaction that follows. But here's the part that makes this even harder to notice. None of these moments feel like mistakes when they happen. They feel natural, automatic, almost necessary. Because silence feels uncomfortable. Not explaining feels risky. Holding back feels like you're hiding something. So you fill the space. You talk. You react. You reveal. And in doing that, you remove the one thing that creates respect in uncertain situations, restraint. Look at people who seem to move differently. In the same situations, they pause. When asked what they're working on, they give just enough, but never everything. When challenged, they don't rush to defend. They let the moment breathe. When meeting someone new, they stay curious instead of exposed. And because of that, something subtle shifts. People can't fully figure them out. And when people can't fully figure you out, they become more careful around you. That's the difference Ethan started noticing everywhere once he became aware of it. It wasn't about being smarter. It wasn't about having better ideas. It was about how much of himself he was putting on display without being asked. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Because suddenly, every situation revealed the same pattern. The person who talks first loses positioning. The person who explains too much loses mystery. The person who reacts instantly loses control. And the one who holds just enough back keeps all three. But even then, there was still something Ethan hadn't fully grasped. Because knowing when you're overexposing yourself is only the first layer. The real question is why it feels so hard to stop. The hardest part for Ethan wasn't realizing he was overexposing himself. The hardest part was stopping. Because once you become aware of it, you start noticing something uncomfortable. The urge to speak doesn't come from logic. It comes from pressure. The pressure to fill silence. The pressure to be understood. The pressure to not be misjudged. And that pressure makes you act fast. Too fast. That's why most people don't actually lack awareness. They lack control in the moment. They know they shouldn't say everything. But when the moment comes, they still do. And that's where the real shift begins. Not in what you know, but in what you do under pressure. Ethan started experimenting with something small. Not a big change. Not becoming silent or distant. Just one simple rule. Delay. The next time someone asked him a question, he didn't answer immediately. He paused. Just for a second longer than usual. It felt uncomfortable at first. Almost unnatural. But something interesting happened. That small pause changed the dynamic. Instead of reacting, he started choosing. Instead of giving everything, he gave just enough. And for the first time, he noticed how much he used to say automatically, without thinking. Then he added another layer. When he shared something, he stopped before the full explanation. Not in a way that felt secretive. Just incomplete. Enough to communicate. Not enough to expose. And this is where most people misunderstand the idea of holding back. They think it means hiding, being fake, or creating distance. But that's not what this is. It's about control. Because when you control what you reveal, you control how others respond. And when you control how others respond, you start influencing outcomes again. But here's the part that changes everything, and almost no one pays attention to it. It's not just about saying less. It's about deciding what version of you people are allowed to see. Because every time you speak, you're not just sharing information, you're shaping an image. And that image becomes the reference point for how people treat you. Ethan realized that before, He was giving people the full picture too early. His strengths, his doubts, his thinking process, all at once. And once that full picture was out, there was nothing left to protect, nothing left to manage, nothing left to control. So he started doing something different. He let people see the result without always showing the process. He let people hear his position without revealing every thought behind it. And slowly, something shifted. People asked more questions. People paid closer attention. People became more careful in how they interacted with him. Not because he changed who he was, but because he changed what he revealed. But even with all of this, there's still a layer most people never reach. Because knowing when to pause and knowing what to hold back are only the surface. The real advantage comes from something deeper. Something that determines not just what you say, but how people feel when they can't fully figure you out. And that's the part Ethan was just beginning to understand, but hadn't fully mastered yet. What made that small change so powerful wasn't the pause itself. It was what the pause interrupted. Before, Ethan's words came straight from emotion. Someone asked, he answered. Someone challenged, he explained. Someone pressed, he revealed more. There was no space between stimulus and response. And when there's no space, there's no strategy. You're not choosing your next move, you're leaking it. That's why the pause worked. It created a gap. And that gap did something most people never realize they need. It broke the automatic pattern. The human mind loves efficiency. It wants to save energy by turning repeated behavior into habits. That's useful in simple things. But in social dynamics, it can quietly become a trap. Because once your reactions become automatic, they stop being yours. They become predictable outputs. And predictable outputs are easy for other people to work around. The pause interrupts that machinery. It forces your brain to switch from impulse to selection. And that shift alone changes the entire interaction. Because now you're no longer speaking to relieve pressure. You're speaking with purpose. Ethan began to notice this almost immediately. In the past, when someone questioned him, he would rush to explain every detail so he wouldn't be misunderstood. But now, with that small delay, he had time to notice something deeper. Not every question deserves a full answer. Some questions are just curiosity. Some are fishing. Some are subtle tests of confidence. And when you answer all of them the same way, openly, fully, instantly, you flatten every situation into the same predictable response. That's why just enough became so effective. It preserved range. It kept Ethan from showing his full map too early. And psychologically, that matters more than most people think. Because when people cannot fully map you, they stay in observation mode. They pay attention. They measure their words more carefully. They stop assuming. And the moment others stop assuming they know you, your position improves. Not because you've manipulated them, but because uncertainty creates caution, and caution creates respect. This is the part many people confuse with mystery or charisma. But a lot of what looks like presence is simply controlled disclosure. The person seems strong not because they are louder, sharper, or more dominant. They seem strong because they are not easy to read. Their emotional state isn't obvious. Their next move isn't obvious. Their internal pressure isn't obvious. And that lack of obviousness changes the atmosphere around them. People become more deliberate. They probe less aggressively. They reveal more about themselves while getting less from you. That imbalance is not accidental. It's a function of restraint. Ethan also realized something else. Revealing less didn't just affect others, it affected him. When he stopped explaining everything, he felt less scattered. When he stopped reacting instantly, he felt less pulled by other people's energy. When he shared only what was necessary, his own thinking became clearer. Why? Because overexposure doesn't only weaken your position externally. It fragments your focus internally. Every unnecessary explanation pulls you outward. Every emotional reaction hands your center of gravity to the room. But restraint pulls that center back. It keeps you anchored. And once you're anchored, your words carry more weight because they come from decision, not from pressure. But here's what Ethan was only beginning to understand. None of this works if you treat it as a surface-level trick. Because the real strength isn't in pausing for effect. It's in changing the internal need that used to make you reveal too much in the first place. And until that deeper need is understood, most people will keep slipping back into the same old pattern, just in a quieter form. At this point, Ethan thought he understood the game. Say less. Pause more. Reveal selectively. And for a while, it worked. People leaned in more. Conversations felt more balanced. He no longer felt like he was constantly giving more than he received. But then something subtle happened. Even when he stayed quiet, sometimes he still felt exposed. Not through his words, but through his reactions. A slight shift in tone. A quick change in expression. A moment of hesitation. And that's when it hit him. The real leak wasn't just in what he said. It was in how he responded. But here's the part most people completely miss. And this is where everything changes. Most people think control is about silence. But silence alone doesn't protect you. Because people don't just listen to your words. They read your patterns. They read your timing. They read your emotional shifts. You can say nothing and still reveal everything. That's the twist. You can hold back information, but still give away your position. And once someone senses your internal state, your urgency, your doubt, your need, they don't need your words anymore. They already know where you stand. That's why some people stay quiet and still get overlooked. And others barely speak, yet command the entire room. The difference isn't volume. It's control under pressure. Ethan started noticing this in real time. In meetings, someone would challenge an idea. Before, he would respond immediately. Now he stayed quiet. But internally, he still reacted. His body leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed. His breathing shifted. And even without speaking, the room could feel it. They could sense where he was affected. And once people sense that, they adjust again. This is why controlling what you say is only the first layer. The deeper layer is controlling how you process the moment before it shows. Because reactions are faster than words. And most people train their words, but never train their reactions. That's why the advantage doesn't last for them. They fix the surface, but the signal underneath stays the same. And people pick up on signals faster than logic. Think about it. Have you ever met someone who barely speaks, but you still feel like you understand them? That's not because they told you. It's because their reactions revealed it. Their discomfort, their eagerness, their need for approval. It all leaks through behavior. And once that leak exists, everything else becomes easier to read. Ethan realized something uncomfortable again. He hadn't actually become less readable. He had just become quieter. And those are not the same thing. Because real control isn't about reducing output. It's about stabilizing your internal state, so there's nothing urgent to reveal in the first place. That's why people like Lucas feel different. It's not that they're constantly holding back. It's that they're not internally reacting the same way. They don't feel the same pressure to prove, to explain, to respond immediately. And because that pressure isn't there, nothing leaks. No tension, no urgency, no signal for others to pick up. And that's where the real shift begins. Because once your internal state becomes steady, your external behavior follows naturally. You don't need to force silence. You don't need to calculate every word. You simply stop giving away things you no longer feel pressured to release. But here's what Ethan was just starting to question. If the real problem isn't what you say, and not even how you say it, then where does that pressure actually come from? And why does it feel so hard to control, even when you know exactly what's happening? It didn't show up as manipulation at first. It felt like normal conversations, normal questions, normal reactions. That's what made it so hard to see. One afternoon, Ethan was talking to a coworker who always seemed friendly, easygoing, supportive. In the middle of the conversation, the coworker asked, "So what's your next move with that project?" It sounded casual. No pressure, just curiosity. And, almost automatically, Ethan started explaining. The direction he was thinking, the parts he wasn't sure about, the timeline he was trying to figure out. The coworker nodded, asked a few follow-up questions, just enough to keep Ethan talking. And by the end of the conversation, Ethan felt like he had a productive exchange. But a few days later, something felt off. That same coworker began suggesting ideas in meetings that aligned perfectly with what Ethan had shared, but with more certainty, more clarity, more confidence. And suddenly, Ethan wasn't the one leading the direction anymore. He was reacting to it. That's when the pattern started becoming clearer. It wasn't that the coworker was smarter. It wasn't that the coworker was more capable. It was that the coworker had better positioning, because they had more information, without giving much in return. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Manipulation rarely looks aggressive. It looks like interest. It looks like engagement. It looks like someone simply asking the right questions while giving away almost nothing about themselves. Another moment hit, even closer. Ethan was in a social setting, talking to someone new. The conversation shifted toward personal experiences. The other person shared just a small story, nothing too revealing. Then they asked Ethan, "What about you?" And without thinking, Ethan went deeper. He shared more detail, more emotion, more context. And the other person listened, nodded, occasionally asked a question, but never matched the same level of exposure. By the end of it, Ethan felt like they had connected. But later, reflecting on it, he realized something unsettling. That person now knew far more about him than he knew about them. His triggers, his past decisions, his emotional patterns, and all he had in return was surface-level information. That imbalance didn't feel dangerous in the moment. But over time, it creates a dynamic where one person has more insight, and therefore more influence. And this is where the real manipulation happens. Not through force, not through control, but through asymmetry. The person who knows more about you than you know about them has the advantage. They can guide conversations. They can predict reactions. They can choose when to push, when to hold back, when to position themselves. And you won't even notice it happening, because nothing feels wrong on the surface. But here's the twist most people never consider. You're not being manipulated because others are highly strategic. You're being manipulated because you're consistently over-contributing. You're filling in the gaps too quickly. You're giving answers before silence does its job. You're revealing layers before trust has actually been built. And because of that, you create an environment where others don't need to invest as much to understand you. Ethan started seeing this pattern everywhere. In conversations where he talked more than he received. In situations where he explained more than was asked. In moments where he reacted faster than necessary. And once he saw it, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Because the realization was simple, but difficult to accept. The more you reveal without being required to, the more control you quietly give away. And most of the time, you don't even realize it's happening until the dynamic has already shifted. But even then, there was still one question that hadn't been answered. If the problem is overexposure, and the result is loss of control, then what exactly separates someone who gets used from someone who stays untouchable in the same situations? If Ethan had never noticed the pattern, nothing dramatic would have happened right away. That's what makes this so dangerous. There's no clear moment where everything falls apart. No obvious signal that something is wrong. Instead, it shows up as a slow, almost invisible drift. You keep doing the same things. You keep thinking you're being open, collaborative, easy to work with. But over time, you start feeling something you can't quite explain. You're always slightly behind, slightly less respected, slightly less in control. And you can't point to a single reason why. That's the cost most people never calculate. Because overexposure doesn't destroy you instantly. It erodes your position gradually. Think about how this plays out over months, even years. You share your ideas early, so others refine them and present them stronger. You show your uncertainty, so people trust your decisions less. You react emotionally, so people learn how to influence your behavior. None of this feels like a major loss in the moment. But stacked together, it compounds. And eventually, you find yourself in a position where you're working just as hard, sometimes harder, but getting less return, less influence, less recognition, less control over outcomes that affect you. And here's the part most people never realize until it's too late. Once people form a stable perception of you, it becomes very difficult to change it. If you've shown yourself as reactive, they expect reactions. If you've shown yourself as overly open, they expect access. If you've shown yourself as predictable, they plan around you accordingly. And perception, once set, doesn't update easily. Even if you improve your skills, even if you start making better decisions, the old pattern still follows you. Because people don't respond to who you've become. They respond to who they believe you are. That's why the real consequence isn't just losing opportunities. It's getting locked into a version of yourself that no longer serves you. A version that others have already figured out, already adjusted to, already optimized against. And breaking out of that is much harder than preventing it in the first place. Ethan started seeing this clearly when he looked at his past interactions. There were moments where he had strong ideas, but they didn't land with weight. Moments where he had valid concerns, but they weren't taken seriously. Moments where he felt overlooked, even when he knew he had value to offer. And the painful realization was this: it wasn't always about the content of what he said. It was about how he had trained people to receive it. By revealing too much, too early, too often, he had lowered the perceived weight of his own voice. And once your voice loses weight, you can't fix it by speaking more. In fact, speaking more usually makes it worse, because it reinforces the same pattern that caused the problem. This is where many people get stuck. They try to compensate. They talk more, explain more, push harder. But all that does is confirm the image others already have of them. And slowly, without realizing it, they become easier and easier to manage, easier to influence, easier to move around. Until one day, they look around and realize they're no longer shaping the environment they're in. They're reacting to it. And that's the final cost. Not just being used occasionally, but losing the ability to control the direction of your own situations. Losing the ability to create outcomes instead of chasing them. Losing the quiet advantage that comes from being someone others can't easily predict. And once that advantage is gone, everything else becomes harder than it needs to be. But what Ethan hadn't fully answered yet was how to rebuild that advantage once it had already been lost. Rebuilding that advantage didn't come from doing more. It came from operating differently. Ethan had to unlearn the instinct to respond and replace it with a system. Not a surface-level trick, but a set of internal rules that guided every interaction. The first principle he discovered was simple, but uncomfortable. Not every situation deserves your full presence. Before, Ethan treated every question as equally important, every conversation as equally worthy of full engagement. But that approach is exactly what drained his leverage. Because when you give full access too easily, you remove any sense of value from it. So he started filtering. Not everything needed a complete answer. Not every opinion needed to be shared. Not every moment required his full attention. And that alone changed how people approached him. Because when access is no longer automatic, it becomes something people have to earn. The second principle went deeper: separate clarity from exposure. Most people think that to be clear, they need to explain everything. But clarity doesn't come from volume. It comes from precision. Ethan began answering in a way that was direct, but not revealing. Enough to communicate his position, not enough to show his entire thought process. And this is where most people fail. They confuse being understood with being transparent. But those are not the same thing. You can be understood without being fully exposed. And that difference is where control lives. The third principle was the hardest to master. Never reward pressure with speed. Whenever someone pushed for an answer, Ethan used to respond faster, as if speed proved confidence. But in reality, speed often reveals urgency, and urgency reveals importance. And once someone knows what matters to you, they know where to apply pressure. So he reversed it. The more pressure he felt, the slower he became. Not artificially, but intentionally. He gave himself time to think, to choose, to decide what was actually worth revealing. And that shift alone made him harder to influence. But here's the part that changed everything, and very few people ever reach this level. Ethan realized that control isn't just about managing information. It's about managing perception over time. Because every interaction isn't isolated. It builds a pattern, and that pattern becomes your identity in the eyes of others. So instead of reacting to each moment, he started thinking in sequences. What you reveal today affects how you're treated tomorrow. What you show in one conversation carries into the next. And once you start seeing interactions as connected, you stop making short-term decisions that cost you long-term positioning. This is what separates people who stay in control from those who keep losing ground without understanding why. It's not intelligence. It's not talent. It's consistency in what they choose to reveal and what they keep. And over time, that consistency creates something powerful. A reputation that is difficult to read. Difficult to predict, difficult to move around. But even with these principles, there was still one layer Ethan hadn't fully mastered. Because knowing what to do doesn't guarantee you'll do it when it matters most. And in high-pressure moments, that's exactly where most people break their own rules. By now, Ethan could see the pattern clearly. It wasn't about a single mistake. It wasn't about one conversation, one decision, one reaction. It was a system he had been running without realizing it. A system where he gave more than he received, where he revealed faster than others, where he reacted before he chose. And over time, that system shaped how people treated him. Not because they decided to, but because he made it easy. And once he understood that, something shifted at a deeper level. Because this was no longer about talk less or be more careful. It was about how he saw every interaction. Every question became a choice. Every response became a decision. Every moment became an opportunity to either keep control or give it away. And that's the level most people never reach. They stay focused on surface behavior. Say this. Don't say that. Be quiet here. Speak there. But they never step back far enough to see the real structure underneath. Because the real structure isn't words. It's patterns. Patterns of revealing. Patterns of reacting. Patterns of positioning yourself in relation to others. And once those patterns are set, they repeat automatically until you interrupt them. Ethan realized that before, he wasn't actually participating in conversations. He was responding to them, letting the flow of the moment dictate what he said, how he said it, when he said it. And that meant he was always slightly behind, because he was reacting to something that had already happened. But now, he started seeing something different. The people who stayed in control weren't reacting. They were setting the pace. They weren't trying to win every moment. They were managing how moments unfolded over time. They understood that influence doesn't come from what you say once. It comes from what you consistently reveal and what you consistently hold back. And that consistency creates a kind of invisible boundary, a line that people don't cross easily because they're not sure what's on the other side. That uncertainty becomes your protection. That restraint becomes your leverage. And slowly, Ethan began to feel the difference. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, subtle shifts. People interrupted him less. People asked more before assuming. People hesitated slightly before pushing too far. And that hesitation was something he had never had before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't intimidation. It was respect created by uncertainty. And that's when the full picture came together. Control isn't about dominating others. It's about not being easily dominated. It's about not giving others the information they need to predict, pressure, or position around you. It's about maintaining just enough distance between what you think and what you reveal so that you stay ahead of the pattern others are trying to form about you. And once you see that clearly, everything changes. Conversations are no longer just exchanges of words. They become environments you navigate, moments you shape, signals you manage, and most importantly, boundaries you control. But even with all of this, one question still remained. Because understanding the system is one thing. Living it consistently, especially when the pressure is high, is something else entirely. At this point, Ethan knew what had to change. Not in theory, but in action. Because awareness without action doesn't protect you. It just makes you notice the same mistake in real time. So he gave himself a set of rules. Not big ones. Not complicated ones. Just small adjustments that would force a different pattern. The first rule was simple. Never answer on the first impulse. No matter how easy the question seemed, no matter how natural the conversation felt, he paused. Even if it was just 1 second longer than usual. That second was enough to break the automatic response. Enough to remind himself, this is a choice, not a reflex. The second rule was even more subtle. Answer the question that was asked, not the one you feel pressured to answer. Before, Ethan would expand. Add context. Explain the background. Fill in gaps no one had asked about. Now he stopped at the edge of the question. If someone asked what he was working on, he gave the direction, not the full plan. If someone asked how he felt, he gave the surface, not the full reasoning behind it. And in doing that, he noticed something strange. Most people didn't push further. They accepted what was given, which meant all those extra details he used to share were never required in the first place. The third rule changed how he handled pressure. Whenever he felt the urge to explain himself, to justify, to defend, to clarify, he treated that urge as a signal. Not to speak more, but to slow down. Because that urge was where the leak started. That's where emotion turned into exposure. So instead of reacting, he let the moment sit. And something unexpected happened. In that silence, the other person often revealed more. They filled the gap. They showed their position first. And suddenly, Ethan had more information than before, without giving anything extra away. But here's where it gets deeper, because these rules are only the visible layer. Anyone can pause. Anyone can say less. But most people still fail here, because they follow the rule without changing the mindset behind it. They stay quiet. But internally, they're still reacting. They hold back, but it feels forced. And that tension leaks in other ways. So Ethan added one more layer. Before every response, he asked himself something simple. What happens if I say nothing right now? Not as a trick, not as a strategy, but as a genuine option. And that question changed everything. because it reminded him that speaking was a choice, not an obligation, that he didn't need to fill every silence, that he didn't need to respond to every signal. And once you truly understand that, your behavior changes without effort. You stop chasing the moment. You start controlling it. But even with all of this, there's still something most people don't see. Because knowing when to pause, knowing how much to say, even knowing how to handle pressure, is still only part of the equation. There's a deeper pattern underneath all of it. One that determines whether these actions become natural or whether you keep slipping back into old habits when it matters most. And that pattern is where the real difference is made. By the time Ethan reached this point, the change wasn't just in what he did, it was in how he saw everything. Conversations were no longer casual exchanges. They were layered. Every question carried intent, even if subtle. Every silence carried meaning, even if uncomfortable. And every response shaped what would happen next. Before, he thought control came from being prepared, being articulate, being open. Now he saw something different. Control came from what you chose not to reveal. Because what you don't reveal can't be used against you, can't be predicted, can't be shaped by someone else. And that creates a kind of freedom most people never experience. But here's where it goes even deeper. Because once you start operating this way, you begin to notice something about other people too. You start seeing who reacts too quickly, who explains too much, who fills silence out of discomfort. And suddenly, patterns become visible everywhere. You see how easily people give away their priorities, their insecurities, their intentions, not because they want to, but because they feel the same pressure you used to feel. The pressure to be understood, the pressure to not be misjudged, the pressure to stay in control by doing the exact thing that causes them to lose it. And once you see that, something shifts inside you. You stop taking everything at face value. You stop assuming every question is neutral. You stop believing every conversation is balanced, not in a paranoid way, but in a precise way. You start recognizing that most interactions are uneven, not because of power, but because of information. One person reveals more, the other reveals less. And over time, that difference compounds into influence, into positioning, into control. Ethan realized that the people who always seemed one step ahead weren't necessarily smarter or more strategic. They were just more disciplined about what they gave away. They understood something simple, but rare, that your value in any interaction is not just what you bring, but what you protect. And once that clicked, he stopped trying to win every moment. He stopped trying to prove his thinking, justify his decisions, explain his position. Instead, he focused on something quieter, maintaining his edge, keeping enough unseen so that no one could fully map him. And the effect of that wasn't immediate. It didn't turn him into a different person overnight. But over time, the pattern reversed. He felt less pulled by other people's expectations, less pressured to respond, less exposed in situations that used to drain him. And more importantly, he started noticing something he had never felt before. Space. Space between what he experienced and what he expressed. Space between what others expected and what he chose to give. And in that space, he had control again. But here's the final layer most people never fully explore. Because once you understand how to protect your information, once you understand how to manage what you reveal, once you understand how to stay unreadable when it matters, you're left with a different question entirely. Not what should I say? Not what should I hold back? But something deeper. Something that determines everything before the moment even begins. Who do you become when you no longer feel the need to reveal anything at all? And if you reach that point, would people still be able to read you the same way they always have? Or would everything about how they see you start to change?